Alright guys, we're going to make this cool little cell phone organizer with billfold tray. It's got a nice spot for your wallet, maybe a watch or some loose change. And the top actually releases, so it's got a great spot for cord management to plug in your cell phone. We're going to show you how to make these leather liners that's backed with cork. It's a great way to pad the surface for your electronics and your valuables. So stick around, we'll jump right into it. Well, I love projects like this because they're small in scale. They don't really take up much lumber, and you can really get creative as to what lumber you want to use for your project. We've decided on walnut in this case. You'll need a little bit of 1/4 inch plywood for the bottom, but it's mainly a hardwood project, so we're going with walnut. I think it would also look really cool to do a maple unit with black leather inserts for the phone organizer, or you might even do zebra wood with wingate accents. So a lot of neat options depending on what hardwood lumber you have available, so get creative and try something that looks good to you. Most of the stock for this project is thin and lightweight, 3/8 of an inch thick in this case, with just a couple pieces of 3/4 inch thickness. So really this is all stuff you should be able to pull out of your scrap bin, stuff you already have on hand. So head over to the scrap bin and get ready to make a beautiful project. Let's head over to the Fusion F2 and start cutting these pieces to size. So like all my power tools, I have a safety loop, which is just a length of extension cord that brings the connection up to the front of the saw. That way I can safely unplug it if I need to make blade changes or do any maintenance on the saw. Another cool feature I have is by pressing the main power switch on the Fusion F2, not only does that fire the saw to life, but it also turns on the dust collector and opens the automatic gate. If you want to learn more about installing a system like this on a Fusion table saw, we'll link up the blog in the description box. Okay, we'll set the high-low fence aside so we can put our X-cut sled on the table saw and trim those parts to length. So the two sides will be 10 inches long, and the front and back pieces will be 8 5/8 inch. We'll square an end and trim these to length. Now the front and back of the billfold organizer need parts that are 9 inches long. The only peculiar thing there is the front is only 3/8 of an inch thick, while the back and the sides are 3/4 thick. Okay, let's regroup and see what we've got. We've got a small stack of parts that'll make the main tray of the organizer, and then some thin pieces that'll make the wallet organizer up top. And that's basically all the parts to this project except for the plywood bottom. And it just reminds me of a couple rules in woodworking. Ideally, you'd like to take your measurements from the project itself rather than the plan. It tends to lead to more accurate measurements when you do it that way. Another rule we live by is to do the joinery before the curves. Now, it's not so much curves per se in this project, but we do have an angled cut to make. So we want to make all the joinery cuts as well as the dado notches in the sides before we go ahead and cut the taper. The sides of the organizer are just what you'd expect. Nice 3/8 inch thick stock by 1 3/4 inch there. And then there's a front and back. The back is a little bit shorter. It matches the length of the low front that we have. But what's a little interesting is the parts for this wallet organizer. There's two sides, a back, and there'll be some lap joinery here, a little rabbet cut in these parts to make things fit together so that we can glue up that assembly. But the interesting thing you'll notice is the front is 3/8 inch thick. All the other parts are 3/4. And that's just a design decision, the way we wanted it to look as a finished product. But it's kind of an interesting look. There'll also be a mid-span divider here. But again, we're going to wait to measure and build that part until we have an exact dimension between the grooves. So the first cuts we need to make are rabbet cuts for the joinery on the wallet organizer. I've made my own sacrificial fence for rabbet cuts. I have these little custom clamps and does a real nice job of securing the auxiliary fence to the rip fence of the Fusion F2. Blade height on these rabbet cuts is 3/16 inch. So once our blade height is dialed in, we'll go ahead and slide our fence over again and make 3/4 inch wide rabbet cuts. So once those rabbets are cut, you can see how the joinery comes together. If we just flip those pieces up into position, the overall dimensions of this little billfold organizer should now be 9 inches long, 5 3/8 inches wide, and just an inch tall. Whenever I can, I'll use the stock itself to set the rip fence. And here what we want is 3/8 of an inch dado stack exposed. I've gone ahead and reset my sacrificial fence here, so I have a fresh, crisp edge here to back up the cut. And we'll go ahead and make additional rabbets for the side pieces. Now at this point in the project, you might be thinking, well, it looks like I've done something wrong here. None of my parts are lining up, but basically your check is that the overall length on this billfold organizer is the same as the width as your overall project. And if those dimensions line up, you're in good shape. The other thing that looks kind of funny is this rabbet that we've cut on our sides is much longer. It's much too wide for this little small front piece. And that's by design. Remember, we're going to cut away this waste material on the sides. It'll all make sense soon. And we'll want to swap out the full dado stack for just a 1/4 inch stack. So to make the 3 notches in each side panel for the envelope holder, we need a 3/4 inch blade height. So again, we can just use our workpiece as a gauge for that 3/4 inch height. Lock in our blade, and we'll make those cuts. For really clean cuts, you can stack those 2 side pieces together, reference them against the rip fence, make sure you have a good sacrificial fence attached to your miter gauge, and make that first notch cut. So next we need a groove in all of our parts to receive some 1/4 inch plywood. This will act as the bottom of both the wallet tray and the overall organizer project. It might be tempting to use a 1/4 inch dado blade to try to cut those slots, but actually the 1/4 inch plywood is significantly undersized compared to a 1/4 inch, so that means we'll have to swap that out for a combination blade and make that groove in 2 passes. We'll set the blade height a little lower than 3/16 of an inch, and that's just so we don't spoil the joinery that we've already cut on our parts. So with the rip fence adjusted and the second pass made, we've got a nice snug fit with the 1/4 inch plywood. We'll make all those cuts now. So with those additional cuts, this is the sort of shape that we have. You can see there's a groove that chases around all of our parts. That'll receive the plywood bottom for both the billfold organizer and the main tray. We've also got these cross-grain dados here that allow us to glue this part together with the plywood bottom in, and then take an actual dimension for this cross divider and add that in later. We'll strike a little line here on the side component to indicate where the taper will start. So we'll taper back right through some of these notches to give it a nice decorative effect. We'll just cut simple slots in the back component, a couple holes, and that'll solve our wire management problems. So we'll go ahead and get this main tray glued up. If you do have a finished side like this cedar plywood, we'll go ahead and face that down. Add a little bit more glue here on the joints, and we'll get this guy glued up. Okay, so the glue's dried and the clamps are off, and we have our two main components now. The billfold organizer and the main tray are all ready to go. The only thing that's not situated at this point is we need to create some relief cuts so that this organizer will register into position on the main tray. Let's head over to the Fusion F2 and make those cuts in a very specific order. So depending on what order you make these cuts, there are some cuts that are flat against the table and some that are up against the fence. And that kind of two-part cut will release the corners so that this tray sits down into the organizer. But if you do those in the wrong order, potentially you could have the waste trapped between the blade and the rip fence. And so we'll start with the cuts that have the tray flat on the table to avoid that sort of problem. And while that finish is drying, we're going to go ahead and laminate a nice piece of veg tan leather to a piece of cork, and that'll make a perfect liner for the organizer. So we'll get started on spray gluing those together. So with that veg tan leather, it will scratch with your fingernails and it just kind of ages naturally. It's a neat product to use. So it's just natural leather, and the cork is just rolls of cork that you can get from the craft store. If you're not into leather, consider lining the shelf with just cork itself. You can spray glue that into place, but we're going to laminate these together in this case. So a little spray glue, it's actually spray contact adhesive like a 3M90. Does a good job. You just coat both surfaces, wait for it to tack over, and then we'll stick those layers together. Once that tacks over just a little bit, you can lay those layers down together, and then we'll just cut it to shape with a rotary cutter. Nice straight square edges. Yeah, looks like that'll be a good fit. What we're going to do is go ahead and tape that down with double-sided woodworking tape, and that'll be a great bond between the unfinished plywood and the cork. So this is actually woodworking style double-sided tape, and that'll do a nice job of permanently securing this into the project. Now you might be wondering, well, why didn't you just spray adhesive the cork down just like we did with the leather? And the short answer to that is you can. you can certainly do that. It's a big masking job to try to tape off this freshly lacquered surface. And so I think sometimes it's easier just to use the double-sided tape. Certainly gives a good bond against the unfinished plywood there. So we'll just press those pieces in place, and this project will be as good as done. Okay, leather liner in place in the bottom there, and the billfold organizer just slides on top. Great little project. In addition to being decorative, the dado notches make a great mail slot. Alright guys, there's the cell phone organizer. It makes a great little weekend project. Try experimenting with the lumber species. Maybe you could try one with walnut and a contrasting maple, or even zebra wood with wenge accents. A lot of different options you can do, and the nice finishing touch is that leather liner. Hey, if you're not into leather, try just the cork. That makes a great backer as well. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Okay.